Good morning, guys. Am I audible to all of you?
Good morning, sir. Yes.
Okay. So, yesterday we have discussed the Fluent API configurations, and that what we are also going to continue today. Today, we are going to basically discuss the different types of relationships that we can manage in Entity Framework, right? So, basically, we are going to discuss one-to-one relationship, or you can say also one-to-zero relationship, one-to-many relationships, and many-to-many relationships. We'll discuss how by default, what is the default conventions which is followed by Entity Framework to implement those relationships, as well as we will also discuss how we can implement those relationships using Fluent API in Entity Framework, right? So basically, we are going to discuss one-to-one or one-to-zero relationships. We will discuss one-to-many relationship, and we will also discuss many-to-many relationship. That is what we are going to discuss today. So let's start today's discussion from one-to-one relationship, or you can say one-to-zero relationship. So we have already discussed what is one-to-zero and what is one-to-one mean. So can anybody tell me what do you mean by one-to-zero or one-to-one? See, first of all, when we are talking about relationship means there are two tables or there are two entities, right? So one-to-zero or one-to-one relationship means so one table having the corresponding data in another table, but that another table have at least that another table might be zero or one record, right? So okay, let me open the notepad, right? So one to one. Right. So one to one means table one, table A having one record, and that record or that corresponding record is also having in table B. So table one, so in this case, one record, right? So that corresponding record is also available in table B, right? So table A having one record and that record having a corresponding record in table B. And if this is the case, then we can say this is one-to-one relationship between the table, right? Now, so now the other scenario, right? In table A, we are having one record, but in table B, the corresponding record is not available. Then what we will say this we will say as one-to-zero relationship. And how we have already discussed how this is represented one and zero, right? So one and zero. So the one record having the corresponding record in another table, but it is if available, then maximum one record is available. If not available, then that is also fine. So if this is the scenario, then you can say this is nothing but your one-to-one or one-to-zero relationship, right? One-to-one means maximum one record is available in the corresponding table. One-to-zero means it might be possible that there are no record available in the corresponding table, right? So if such kind of relationship is implemented, then we can say that it is one-to-one or one-to-zero relationship. One-to-one or you can say zero relationships, right? There is a matching record is available or not. That might be the case. Clear, guys? What do you mean by one-to-one or zero relationship?
Yes, sir.
Right? So basically, you are having two tables, table A and table B. You establish some kind of a relationship using primary key or unique key as well as a foreign key constant, right? So in that case, it is so in the principal table, you are having one record. In the dependent table, the corresponding record might be present or might not be present. If present, then maximum one record is present. If not present, then that is also fine. If one record is present in the dependent table, then we can say there is a one-to-one relationship between the two tables. If no record is present in the dependent table, then we can say there is a 1 to 0 relationship between the tables. So if you implement such kind of relationships, then we can say it is a 1 to 1 or 0 relationship. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So the question is how we can implement this in using how we can implement this in SQL Server. Okay, so can anybody tell me how we can implement this in SQL Server? Right. Let's assume that table A having some column 1 called ID, right? Column ID. This is column name, right? And table B, right? Table 2, it is also having column ID and a column name. So in this two table, if I want to make the 1 to 1 or 0 relationship, then how we can implement this? Can anybody tell me? So I'm not talking about entity framework point of view. I am talking about SQL Server point of view. So let's assume that if I make this record as a primary key, and if I make this record as a primary key as well as foreign key, then is this going to be 1 to 1 or 0 relationship? For example, you insert one record here, right? So REC1, you insert, let assume its value is 1001 and the name is some name 1, right? So as you mentioned this as the primary key and this as the foreign key, see, in this case, I insert one record into this table, but I have not insert any corresponding record of this column ID 1001 in table 2. So in this case, right, in this case, between these two tables, now what kind of a relationship? Is this record 1001 available in table 2? Guys?
No.
No. So if the corresponding record is not available, so in this case, this is my principal table. You can consider this is your principal table. And this is your dependent table. Dependent. So in this case, this record is available here, but the corresponding record is not available in table 2. So then in this case, this is going to be 1 to 0 or 1 to 1 relationship between these two tables.
1 to 0.
1 to 0. Now what I'm doing, I'm inserting one record here. Right? I'm inserting one record here. So now, so now the corresponding record of this table is available in the dependent table or not?
Yes.
So in this case, what kind of a relationship is this?
1 to 1.
1 to 1. Now, is this valid? So now valid means it is a foreign key. Foreign key means the value what you are entering into this table will be checked in the principal table. Whether this value is available or not. Yes, this value is available. Then this is accepted or not.
Yes.
Right. Now, I'm trying to insert another record with the same date. Is this valid? Is this valid or not?
Yes.
How it is valid? So what is this?
No. For primary key purpose, it's not valid.
So primary key means, can you enter same value twice?
No.
No, that means this is not valid. So if you try to enter the corresponding data twice in this table, then it is not accepted. That means this is not valid, right? So if it is not valid, that means what? Now it means if you mark the primary key, if you mark this column as primary key as well as foreign key, right? If you mark the primary key column as the foreign key column, then it will implement what kind of a relationship in database?
1 to 1 or 1 to 0.
1 to 1 or 1 to 0 relationship. right? Is that clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. Now what is our agenda? So we will try to implement the same thing, right? So what we are going to do, we are going to maintain or we are going to implement 1 to 0 or 1 to 1 relationship, right? Between two tables. One is student entity and another one is student address entity. So it might be possible that you entered one student information, but you didn't enter student address. If you enter the student data, but you didn't enter the student address, then in that case, it is going to be 1 to 0 relationship. Again, if you enter the student information as well as you enter the student address information, then in that case, it should be going to be 1 to 1 relationship. So one student should not have more than one. So our requirement is one student means one address. It should not have one or more than one address. It might be possible that from the initial time we are not entering the student address, but if we are entering, then we should not enter more than one address. So in situations like this, we need to implement a 1 to 1 or 1 to 0 relationship between the student and a student address entity. So let us understand how to implement this. First of all, you need to create the student class. Okay. This is my student class. I have copy pasted the things. So here what I'm doing, I'm creating student ID, first name, last name, and I'm having a reference column, right? Which is pointing to the address property right now. So second, I have to create the student address table. So in student address table, what I'm doing, okay, let me open the student address. So I'm just copy pasting, right? So in this case, I'm entering some student address ID. So this is going to be my primary key, address line 1, address line 2, pin code, city, state, country, and it is also having one virtual property which is pointing to the student entity, right? Clear, guys? The point that you need to remember, this student address and this student, these are a reference navigation property or these are collection navigation property or reference navigation property.
Reference navigation property.
Exactly. So basically, whenever you are going with the one to many or many to many, in that scenario, you have to go with the collection navigation property, right? But whenever you are trying to implement some kind of 1 to 1 or 1 to 0 relationship, right? Then in that case, you need to go with the reference navigation property. In that case, what will happen? Now, in this case, while entering the student data, you can enter maximum one student information because it's a reference type. It's not a collection where you can enter multiple student information. Similarly, when entering the student information, you can insert maximum one student address. You cannot insert more than one student address. And further, if you remember, further, if you notice, the student address is a reference type or a primitive type,
It's a
right?
reference type.
Reference type means it can store also null value. Null means when the corresponding data is not available, and in that case, it is going to implement a 1 to 0 relationship. But if you are entering the student address, then it is going to implement a 1 to 1 relationship. Clear?
Yes.
Right. And guys, if you want to learn what are the different kind of relationships, we have already discussed in Entity Framework, right? Just go to the link what I'm also providing in the description, so you can understand what is primary key, what is foreign key, what are navigation properties, again what are reference navigation, collection navigation, what are the different kind of 1 to 1, 1 to many, and relationship we have already discussed. So just go through it and you will have some idea, right? So again, I'm also going to discuss these things in detail. So how we are going to implement the 1 to 1 relationship, right? From SQL Server point of view, when a primary key of one table becomes the primary key and foreign key in another table, then it is said to be in 1 to 1 or 1 to 0 relationship. See, in this case, this call ID is the primary key, and this call ID becomes the primary key in another table, not only the primary key but also the foreign key. So when the primary key of one table becomes the primary key as well as foreign key in another table, then such kind of a relationship we can represent it as 1 to 1 or 1 to 0. Clear?
Yes.
Okay. So what we need to do? So we need to configure the app of student and student address entities in such a way that Entity Framework API should create the students and student address table in the database and makes the student ID column in the students table as the primary key and student address ID column in the student address table as the primary key and the foreign key. So what is our requirement? Our requirement is we need to make the relationship. First of all, we need to create one table in the database with the name students, and we also need to create another table in the database with the name student addresses. Then what we need to do? We need to make this as the primary key. This is going to be my primary key, right? And this student address, it is going to be my primary key and my foreign key. And this foreign key will point to what? It will point to students table primary key. Clear, guys? What is our requirement? We need to implement this. So we need to make sure the student ID should be generated as the primary key in the database. The student address ID is also going to be the primary key in the student addresses table. But important thing is that apart from this student address ID also becomes the foreign key, which should point to the students table primary key. If we implement this, if we tell the entity framework to do these things in the database, then ultimately it is going to implement the one-to-one and one-to-zero relationship between the student and the student addresses table, right? So how we can implement, right? So how we can implement means we need to use two methods. One is HasOptional and one is WithRequired. What this HasOptional method will do, it configures an optional relationship for the entity type. And what this WithRequired, it configures the relationship to be optional required with a navigational property. So what is the use of these two methods? Let us try to understand with one example. So what is this use optional and what is this we can say required, right? So basically what I'm going to do, I'm just going to modify. You know what is this drop create database always data is, right? So what is this? So basically in the constructor of the context class, I'm initializing the database uh, create database always, right? I'm initializing the database initializer as drop create database always. That means every time we run the application, it is going to drop the database and create the database as per our requirement, right? And again, if you see what are the database tables we are going to create in the database, we are going to create one database for the student entity. The database table name is going to be students, and another database with the name student addresses, right? And the student addresses will point to the student address entity, right? So now what is our requirement? We need to configure the one-to-one or one-to-zero relationship between the student and the student address table. And for this, we need to use two important methods, or you can say two important Fluent API methods. So first of all, you need to provide the student entity because it is going to be my principal entity, right? So I'm entering the student entity. So student entity mark address property optional in the student entity. So if you go to the definition of student entity, there is a property called optional. So what do we need to do? We need to mark that student address. So that address property optional. So this will make sure that the student optional means what? It is not mandatory. It is not mandatory means what? It is not mandatory means you can, while entering the student data, it is optional to enter the address data. If you have address data, you just enter the address data. If you do not have address data, then don't enter the address data. Then the second important method what we are using is with required. So with required means it is mandatory. So mark student property as required in student address entity with required. So this is STD for student and this is entity for address. So here, if you go to the student address table, then there is a student property, right? So student property. So what our requirement is, we need to mark the student address mandatory. So what it means? So it means if you are entering the student address, then it is mandatory you should have one student. If you do not have one student, then how you can enter the foreign key value? Trying to understand, guys? So for that purpose, we are making student as the required attribute in the student address. Okay, so for better understanding, let assume we do not have this data. Right? Let assume we do not have this data. If we do not have this data, right, then the guys tell me, can I insert this record here?
No.
So this is nothing but your student entity, right? And this is nothing but your student address entity, right? So it means what? Now, if you want to enter any record in the student address entity, then first of all, that student entity must be exist in the student database table. If the student entity is not exist in the principal entity or in the a student database table, then you cannot insert that record in the student address. For student address, the student entity is mandatory. So this is what it is mentioning here. For student address, right, with requirements for student address, the student entity is required. Now, can I insert one record here without inserting the record in the student address table? Is this possible?
Yes.
Because for student, this student address is optional. If you do not have student address, no worry. So you can insert one student entity without student address, but you cannot insert one student address without student. So this is what it is mentioned. For student, address is optional. For student address, student is optional. So if you use these two Fluent API methods, right, then it is going to implement one-to-one or one-to-zero relationships, right? But before that, you should have some student address and you should have the reference address students, right? So first of all, you need to declare the, you need to create the classes like this, and then using the HasOptional method and with required method, you can specify whichever property is the reference property, and you need to make sure that reference property is optional in the principal entity, and you need to make sure that uh, required, right, that reference property is required in the dependent entity. And once you modify these things, right, once you done these changes, then entity framework is going to create a two database table, students and student addresses. Then in the student addresses table, it will mark the primary key as well as the, it will mark the primary key as well as the reference foreign key, right? So the primary key will also become the foreign key in this table, and that foreign key will pointing to the primary key of the students table. So these are the changes that we need to do in order to make the primary key and the foreign key relationships, right? So once we modify this thing, then we need to do some changes in the context class, right? So what I'm trying to do, you can see. So in this case, student address is optional. But what I'm doing, I'm creating the address line 1, address line 2, and here I'm entering the first name, last name, and I'm also specifying the address value. So this address value is optional. If you want, you can specify. If you do not want, you do not need to specify. And then I'm just adding the student. So in this case, when I add the student, you will observe this first name, last name is entered into the student table, as well as this address details. So what you specify in the address property will automatically inserted into the student addresses table when you call the save changes method, right? So let me, with the above changes in place, now let us run the application. Okay, before that, let me delete this database. Right? Okay. Now run the application. So whenever the database is going to be created, it is going to take some time. If the database is already created, then it will not take some time, right? It will immediately perform the database operations, right? So now refresh the database. And here you can see the database EF code first DB, and just expand the tables folder. This is my student table. Here you can see student ID is the primary key. And if you go to the student address, then you will see that this is not only my primary key, but also it is my foreign key, right? Further, if you select the data, then you will see one record is there, but we have not insert those data, but automatically this record is inserted. And if you go to the students table, then also you will see one record. And if you expand this script, this create script, then you will see it is creating the foreign key, which is pointing to the students table primary key. So where is the foreign key? So this is my student primary key. So this is my reference key, right? This is my foreign key, which is pointing to the students table, student ID column. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. Now what is what if you do not? So in this case, I'm showing the example. So in this case, the example what I'm showing, it is one to one, right? Because while entering the student entity, we are also entering the student address. Now what I'm trying to do, I'm just ignoring the student address, right? So if you remember, student address is optional, right? Because it is so student address, it's a reference type. So if you do not specify the value, then it is also fine. So if you do not specify the student address, then also it is going to work as expected. So it will not give you any kind of error, because student address is not mandatory, right? So student address is not mandatory. You can create the student address right later, but for now we are just entering the student details. And you can see, so in this case, you can see both the tables are created, but in this case, the student table, student address table, same, everything is same. But if you expand the student address table, then you will see nothing is there, because student address is optional. So while entering the student data, it is optional to enter the student address data. But for now, we are having one student. So what is the student? So we are having the student ID 1, right? So is that clear?
Yes.
Right? So this is how you can implement one to one or one to zero relationship between two entities using Fluent API. So you have to remember two methods. First of all, you need to declare the reference property in both the entities. So this is student, this student class reference property pointing to student address, and student address also having one reference property pointing to the student object, right? And then in the class, you need to make sure which one is going to be your primary principal entity. For me, student is the principal entity. So I have specified the principal entity here. Then I have specified what is the optional attribute, right? So in this case, address is optional. And for student address, you need to make sure student is going to be mandatory, or it is going to be required by using the with required method. So this is the thing that you need to remember. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Any question from anyone? Okay. So next, what we are going to discuss is one-to-many relationship in entity framework. So next, what we are going to discuss, one-to-many relationship between two entities, and we will understand how we can implement this using the default convention as well as using a Fluent API. Anyone saying anything? Okay, fine. So basically, we are going to understand this concept by using this student and standard database tables, right? Or you can say student and standard entities. So what we need to implement? We need to implement one student having one standard. A particular student belongs to a particular standard, but a particular standard can be taken by many students. So from student to standard, from standard to student, this is nothing but your one-to-many relationship. One student belongs to one standard, but one standard can have many students. Clear, guys?
Yes.
right? So this is what we need to implement. Okay, let us first create the entity. So let me create the student entity. Already we have a student entity. Let me modify the student entity, and then let me modify the standard entity. So if you see, these are very simple, straightforward. Student having only ID name properties, and standard also having some uh, standard ID, standard name, and a description properties, right? So we need to implement the relationship between these two entities. We want to make sure one student, so if I'm entering one student, then that student having a corresponding, so in this case, the standard is going to be my primary key, and student, so the standard is going to be your principal entity, and student is going to be your dependent entity. So while I'm entering the student data, that student data should have a corresponding standard information, but that standard information might be taken by many students. See, suppose there are 5 students: student 1, student 2. Student 1 having the standard ID standard 1, student 2, student 3, they might be got the standard 2, right? So in that way, one student having one standard, but that standard might be taken by multiple students. So this is what we are going to achieve using one to many relations, right? Again, using entity framework, we can implement the one to many relationship in two ways, right? One way is by following the default conventions and by following the Fluent API configurations, right? Let us first try to understand by following the default conventions, and then we'll try to understand how we can implement the one-to-many relationship by using the Fluent API configurations, right? What do we mean by following conventions, right? There are certain conventions in Entity Framework which, if we follow in entity classes, then it will automatically implement one-to-many relationship between two tables in the database, right? What it means? It means certain conventions is there in entity framework, and if we follow those conventions while we are designing our domain classes, then entity framework API will automatically implement one to many relationship between the tables in the database. In this case, in that case, right, if we are following the such conventions, right, while designing our entities, then as a developer, for implementing one to many, as a developer, we do not need to configure anything else. Everything will be taken care by the entity framework. Now let us try to understand what are all such conventions and how Entity Framework is going to implement, or how Entity Framework is going to create one to many relationship between two database tables in the corresponding database, right? So basically we are going to see how Entity Framework API will implement one to many relationship between student and standard in the database table. So basically in that case, we need to follow some conventions, right? What are the conventions? Let us try to understand. So first convention, our requirement is to establish one to many relationship between student and standard entity. That means one student can be associated with one standard, and one standard can be assigned to many students. So basically this is what we need to implement, right? One student can be associated with one standard, and one standard can be assigned to many students. We can achieve this very easily by including a reference navigation property of type standard in the student entity class, right? So what it means? So it means in the student entity class, if we import a standard navigation property, right, then it is automatically, right? So where is my student? So what is this? Is my standard entity, and if you implement the standard entity in the, see, in this case, I'm not entering. So okay, in the standard class, we do not have any kind of reference properties. In the student class, I just include a reference navigation property which is pointing to the standard. So if we provide this property, right, then automatically entity framework going to implement one to many relationship, right? So what is the standard? So let me, this is my student and this is my standard. So let me create this one. Let me comment all these things. This is not required, right? So next, what we need to do, we have to modify the main method. So what I have done here, So I have just removed the Fluent API configurations because I'm going with the default conventions, right? So that's why I have delete everything from this method. And here I'm just telling Entity Framework to create two database table. One table name is students, which is pointing to student entity. Another table name standards, which is pointing to standard entity. And further, what are the changes I have done? So I have only include one reference navigation property of type standard in the student entity. And then I'm going to modify the main method, right? So what I'm doing here, I'm creating one standard entity, and then I'm creating one student entity, and then I'm adding that student, right? Then I'm adding that student, and then I'm calling the step changes method, right? Now, student, and then I have to provide the standard information here. Standard equals to standard, right? So, right, right. So in this case, we have added one standard and we have added one student information, right? So let me give the standard ID 1, right? And let me add this one, and let me provide this one here, right? So basically, I have added one standard and I have added one student. While adding the student, I have specified the standard ID. So now I'm going to call the step changes method. Before that, let me delete these things because this will cause some issue. Issue in the sense it will tell that the database is currently in used, so you cannot modify the database. So let me delete the database, and once I delete, let me run the application. Right? So student is added, and what I need to do, I just need to update the script here. Okay. So now if you go to the database, refresh the database, you will see tables. So this is standard, right? This is standard ID. This is going to be my primary key, and this is going to be my foreign key. So you will see this is standard ID, and this is my foreign key standard underscore standard ID. So whenever you created the foreign key as a different column other than the primary column, then it is going to implement one to many relationship. If student ID in this case, if in this case, if student ID along with the primary key, if it becomes the foreign key, then it is going to 1 to 0 or 1 to 1. But if the foreign key is created separately other than the primary key, then in that case, it is going to implement one-to-many relationship between the standard and the student entities. Now, multiple student you can enter into this table, and multiple student can have the same standard ID. So currently, this is the standard ID. So if you open this database, then you will see that this table, the student Pranay having the standard ID 1. Now let me do one thing. Now let me comment these things, right? Right. Let me comment these things also. Pranay to Raj to. I'm giving the same standard information, right? Let me run the application once more, right? Now verify the database. Now verify the database. See, two students having the same standard ID. That means it is one to many relations. right? The standard ID, right? What is there inside this table? Having two records, right? So if you see the standard ID having two records in this table, but this particular student, right? Student whose ID is one, that student having only a single standard ID, but that single standard ID can be given to multiple students. So this is nothing but your one-to-many relationships. Clear, guys?
Yes, sir. Clear.
Right?
Yes.
So this is how you can implement one-to-many relationship using the one of the approach which is a default convention approach, right? So what you just need to do, you just need to put a reference type property in the student entity which is pointing to the standard, right? So this is the simplest way, or you can say this is one of the approach, right? Let me set these things back to previous steps. Okay, now let us delete this
Doubt
one.
actually.
Sorry.
I have a doubt here. Like,
Yeah.
uh, in the table that you created, no, for standard, well, the column is the value is two. Means it is different record. No? It is not
Sorry,
referring to the same.
sorry. Can you tell me once more?
Yeah. Can you please open that standard record?
Standard ID
Okay.
1, 2,
And
right? And
yeah,
let me open the
the
other record
student.
also here. Select star from students, right? Yeah.
So the student ID.
See, in this case, what happened now? It is creating a new standard, and that ID it is inserting here.
Yeah, I mean, like it is not referring to the same record. It is
Right.
referred to a
This
different
is the
records.
problem. We'll overcome this problem little bit. Right. So
Okay.
in this case, this standard, right? This standard it is representing here. This standard it is representing here. Why we are facing this problem? Because we do not have any ID, any property which is pointing to the standard ID. Right. We can overcome this problem in some time. So you mean you need to say that I want to enter this one value here as well as here, right?
Yeah, I mean that is what means of
That,
one
that,
to
that
many
is that
relationship.
is what I'm going to discuss in some time,
Okay. Good.
right? So this is one of the approach of creating the primary key and foreign key relationship. The second approach is that another way to implement one. So these are the approach default conventions. I'm not using Fluent API as of now. So these are the default conventions which is followed by Entity Framework to create one-to-many relationships, right? Another way to implement one-to-many relationship is using convention is to include a collection navigation property in the principal entity. Here standard is the principal entity and student is the dependent entity. So we need to include a collection navigation property student within the standard entity. So what I'm going to do, so this is the standard. So in the standard entity, I'm just entering one collection navigation property. So this standard will tell this standard can have many students. So this is a collection. Collection means many. Many means one standard can have many students, and here one student can have one standard. So this is the things, right? The rest of the things is going to be right. Next, you can simply see if you want you can keep this property, if you want you can simply ignore this property. This is not going to be create any issue, right? So but the thing is that, right, now let me context dot this is okay. Now let me run the application. Oh my God. So we have to delete these things. Otherwise, it will throw you some exception that database is currently being used. Right? Now, let me run the application. Now, if you check the database, right? So you will see that this is standard table. The standard ID is there, and this is the columns, and you can see standard underscore standard ID. It is the foreign key column. So the thing is going to be same. So this is another approach, but the problem with this approach is same. Now another way to implement one-to-many relationship is by including the what I can say, by including both the navigation properties, right? Both the navigation properties means if you can uncomment this one, right? And this is the standard navigation property, and this is the collection navigation property. In this case, also it is going to work in the same way, right? Now, if you run the application, then you will also see that both the tables are going to contain, right, the same structure, right? So here you will not find any difference, right? Any difference in the sense the structure is going to be shared, right? So this is my student table, and you can see this is standard underscore standard ID. Now, what is my requirement? I don't want to use this standard underscore standard ID, which is automatically generated by the student table. Rather than I'm going to create a new column with the name standard ID, which should be the foreign key, right? So for that purpose, what I need to do? So can anybody tell me what I need to do? Simply include, right? Simply include this property, right? Simply include the standard ID. That's it. So then you need to context dot set changes. Then what you need to do? You need to use standard ID equals to standard ID one dot standard ID. Clear? So in this case, what will happen? Now, in this case, if you see, if it will not find the, so in this case, once you include this reference navigation property, if you remember in the data annotation time, you have already discussed. If once you include the reference property, then it will search for the property which is the primary key in this entity. So in standard entity or standard table, what is the primary key name? The primary key name is standard ID. So it will search for a property with the same name. If it is found, then it will make that property as the foreign key. If it is not found, if this property is not found, then by default it will go with the name. Right? What is the default name? Standard underscore standard ID. So standard underscore standard ID. This is the default name which is provided by Entity Framework. But if this property will only be available if this property is not available. Once you provide this property, right, then that's it. We do not need to do anything special right now. Just run the application, right? Right, student added. Now, if you verify the database, you will see that one student added. And if you go to the standard table, then you will see that one standard ID is there, right? Now, what is I'm going to do? I'm just commenting these things, right? So I'm here providing the standard ID as one, right, which is already created in the database. And now what I'm going to do, I'm just commenting these things so that the existing data will be kept as it is. Now run the application, right? Student added. Now This is the standard table. So you can see only one standard is there, and this is the student table, and you can see one and one is there. Clear, guys? Clear?
Yes.
So Bhargav, you asking that question, right?
Yes.
Now you clear?
Yeah.
So basically, whenever you are going with the convention, if you are making any foreign key, please make sure that depend and that principal entity foreign key column should be there. If it is there, then you can use that property to insert the corresponding data, right? So this is the default convention which is followed by Entity Framework to create the one-to-many relations. Now it's time to understand how we can use the Fluent API, right? How we can use the Fluent API to implement one-to-many relationships, right? Generally, we do not need to configure the one-to-many relationship in Entity because one-to-many relationship convention cover all combination, right? So by default, this default convention is working fine, right? Working as expected, right? We do not need to go for Fluent API for configuring this one-to-many relationship because by default, without doing any kind of a configurations, we can implement one-to-many relationship. Then why I should go for Fluent API? But if you want, right, then you can also still go for Fluent API. Then how we are going to implement one-to-many relationship using Fluent API? Let me show you, right? So basically, what is my requirement? This is my student entity, right? So you can see here, I'm creating one navigation property of type standard. But now, you can see if current standard, right? So let me change the second one. Second one is standard table. Okay. So in this case, what exactly I'm doing, I'm creating one standard. And here I'm providing the current standard as standard ID 1, right? So what I'm doing here, I'm just doing some changes, right? So what are the changes? The changes is I'm creating one property called current standard ID, and this is my reference property, which is pointing to the standard table. And here I'm creating one standard and setting that property as the value of a current standard. Right now, run the application. Okay, before running the application, we need to stop, right? Because I need to first delete these things. Now run the application. Right now, just go to the database and check the things. See, you can see current standard underscore standard ID becomes the foreign key. But what is my requirement? My requirement, I don't want to use that default name. I also don't want to use the standard ID. But I want to make this current standard ID as the foreign key. And if you want to do such kind of things, right, you do not want to go with the default naming convention which is followed here, or if you do not want to go with the standard naming, the default standard ID, you don't want to make that column, that foreign key column as standard ID. Rather, you want to make sure that current standard ID should become the foreign key. And in situations like this, you need to go with what? You need to go with Fluent API conventions, right? So how we are going to implement Fluent API? See, first of all, you need to configure. So you know what is this? I'm not going to explain this at database set initializer. So I'm not going to explain these two things what I'm doing. So here we need to focus on this piece. So what entity you want to configure? I want to configure student entity. So within the entity generic method, you need to provide the student. So this student entity are having one required attribute, that is current standard, right? And so here basically you have to understand three methods: has required, with many, and has foreign key. So to understand these things, so what I need to do, let me copy these things, right? Let me put it here. Right, right. Okay. See, just read this. First, we need to start configuring with one of the entity class. So first, see, whenever you are going to provide any kind of a configurations, then you need to decide on which entity I need to provide the configuration, and how you are going to provide the entity configuration by using model builder, that entity generic method, and to this method you need to specify the entity name, and in this case the entity name is student. Then the second method, what you using here, has required standard, thus a start to current standard. So this is the method. What exactly this method is? This method specifies that the student entity has required the current standard properties, right? So student entity has required the current standard property. This will create a not null foreign key column in the student database table. So what exactly it means? It means while you are entering the student entity, you have to specify the current standard entity value. It is mandatory, right? So while you are entering, so specify that student entity has required the current standard property. This is the required property, and this property pointing to which entity? Standard entity. So in this case, this is a required. Required means what? Required means it is going to create the column, right? It is going to create the column in the database as not null. So it will create this column as not null. It will make this as the foreign key, and this foreign key will pointing to the standard table primary key. Standard table primary key. So the meaning of this statement is this. So this current standard property of student entity is a required property. So required property means the type is going to be not null, and this property will pointing it. This property will be created as a foreign key as you have specified the standard. So this foreign key will pointing to the standard entity or standards, the database table which is mapped to standard entity. That table name is going to be standards database table primary key. So this foreign key will pointing to the standards database table, standards table primary key. The second point is gone. The third one is with many. So with many, std.student specifies that the standard entity class include many student entities. So here you specify the standard entity. This standard entity can include many students. So that means it is going to implement one-to-many relationships, right? Here many represents the I collection type property. So in standard entity, do you have any property which is of type I collection? Okay, just go to the standard entity. In the standard entity, do you have any property of I collection type? Yes, we are having one property of type I collection, and that property name is student. So here you need to specify that property. So that means what? This standard database table having uh, one to many relationship with the students database table, right? Then the has foreign key specify the foreign key property in the student entity. So this has foreign key, this will specify that the type of this foreign key property in the student entity is going to be integer type. So if you want to implement one to many relationship using Fluent API, then you need to do this kind of things, right? So first of all, these are the things, right? and then you need to do the changes like this. But if you are going with, if you simply put this standard ID, no configuration is required. These things are not required, right? So these configurations are not required, right? So if you put these things, then this is required, right? So let me explain you these things once more. We are going to configure the student entity. This student entity having one reference property, right? That reference property will pointing to the standard entity, right? So if you go to this is the current standard, this is the reference property, which is pointing to the standard, right? So in this case, it is going to create a foreign key, right? That foreign key is going to be not null, and that foreign key will point to the standard stable primary key. Then this standard entity having with many relationship with the student entity, and in the student database table, right, where the foreign key is going to be created, we want this current standard ID property to be the foreign key, right? If you go to this table or this entity, then you will see that this is the one of the property, and you want to make this property as the foreign key, right? So suppose you are having some other property, right? Some standard ID2. You want to make this standard ID2 as the foreign key, then you just simply need to specify standard ID2 here. Clear, guys? So I'm just removing these things, and I'm just removing these things, right? So here, just specify the entity, specify the property in the sense the reference property of the student entity, which will establish the relationship. Then specify the standard entity having many relationships with the student entity. Then you need to specify whichever column or whichever property you want to make the foreign key, and what is the type of that property that you need to specify here, right? And further, if you see, these things are showing in blot. So this is not mandatory. If you remove, then that is also fine, because he know the entity, current standard entity, he know the type of this current standard is going to be student. So no need to specify these things, right? And here it is also known that the type of this property is integer, so no need to specify the integer type. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Right
Clear.
now what we need to do, we need to do some changes in the main method, right? So let me modify the program class. So in the program class, what I'm doing, I'm just adding one standard, right? Standard ID 1, description 1. Okay, standard name equals to, let me give this as standard 1, standard 1, description as standard 1, right? Standard added, and here I'm adding one entity, and current standard ID, I'm just providing the standard ID dot standard ID, right? And then I just need to save the changes, right? With the above changes in place, okay, database is ready, everything is ready, run the application. Right? Student added and standard added. Now, if you verify the database, then you will see that whatever the property we specify in the Fluent API, that current standard ID will become the foreign key. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right? This is how you can implement one-to-many relationships. Right? So if you remember one thing, right? If you are creating some kind of a foreign keys, right? Then there is a concept, some concept is there, right? If you are updating the foreign key value, then what should, if you are updating the primary key column value, what should happen to the foreign key table data, right? So you suppose you are deleting the if you are deleting the primary, okay, let me give you one example. So this is my table 1, right? This column is there, and there are two records, right? 101, right? 1002, right? So some value, let's see, value 1 and a value 2, right? So with this record, we are having some data. So we are having some value 11, right? We are having some value 22 like this. We are having some data in the corresponding table. Now what will happen if I delete this? If I delete this, then this is the primary key table. This is the foreign key table. In the primary key table, if I delete the data, my requirement is to delete the corresponding foreign key table data also, right? Try to understand my question. So if I want to delete this data from the primary key table, or the principal table, I also need to delete the data from the foreign key table. Then in situations like this, right, we need to use the cascade delete options, right? Apart from that, if you update the data, right? If you update the data, then what you need to do, right? Suppose my foreign key value is updated. The value is updated. Then you do not need to do anything here, right? Because the this ID is going to be same. The value is updated. That means that updated information will be available to everyone, right? So this is the point that you need to remember. If you want to delete, if the primary key table data is deleted, then you want to delete the corresponding foreign key table data. If that is the scenario, then what you need to do and how you can handle this. So cascade delete means, so we need to use cascade delete using Fluent API. So what is cascade delete? Cascade delete means automatically delete the child rows. So child rows means what? These are nothing but your child rows. Automatically delete the child rows when the corresponding primary key rows are deleted. So this is the point that you need to remember. So cascade delete means automatically deleting the child rows when the related parent row is deleted. For example, if standard is deleted from the standard table, then automatically all the students belong to that standard should also be deleted from the students table. To implement this, we need to use will cascade on delete Fluent API method. So it's very simple, right? So what you just need to do, right? So while configuring the entity, so you just need to use this will cascade delete option. So once you do this, right? So currently, how many records are there in the database? Students table, one record is there, right? And in the standard table, how many records are there? One record is there. So now what I'm trying to do, so variable standard equals to, right? Tell me guys, what is the query to fetch the standard information? Context dot standards dot, I want to find by primary key and I'm providing the value as one. So it will give me the standard information, right? So now tell me how to state the, how to modify the entity state as modified. What is the syntax, guys? Guys, even I forgot the syntax. Okay. Context dot, then standards, context dot standards dot. There is a method called remove, and to this method I need to provide the standard entity, right? And then I need to call the save changes method, right? So standard deleted, right? I don't want to delete the database. I have set these things. Okay, so I have done some mistake. Hmm. right? So first of all, I need to create the database with this option, then I need to delete, right? So right? So data is added. Now I'm going to comment this one. I don't want to drop the database, right? And I have written the code to remove the record, right? So I'm going to modify the main method. And if you open the database, then you will see that select tar from standards, then select star from students, right? So you will see that there are one record in the database, right? Now, once I execute this code, it will fetch the standard, it will remove that standard, and it will remove that standard from the database also, right? And once it remove, then this message will be displayed, right? So let me run the application code. Standard deleted. Now just verify the database. We have deleted the standard, but do we have deleted the student data? Do we have written any code to delete that student information whose standard is 1? Guys?
No.
No. But now let me execute the application and see the data. So what happens? Now it means once we use this with cascade on delete option, right? Then whenever you delete the parent row, then the corresponding child rows are automatically deleted from the tables. Is that clear?
Yes.
Right? So this is how this cascade delete option work in Entity Framework, right? So the last one, what we are going to discuss today is many-to-many relationship. It's very simple, right? So many-to-many relationship means what? Now, many-to-many relationship means what? Now, a row in one table, let's say table A, can have many matching rows in another table. Let's say table B. Suppose one row in a table. Suppose we are having table A, that table A having one row, then that particular row can have multiple matching row in table B. And vice versa also too. That means what? Now a row in table B can also many matching rows in table A, right? So it's a kind of concatenations, you can say. So some of the data, right? For example, if this is the table, so 101, right? So some data is there, some data is there. So this is column ID value 1, right? And this is value 2, value 2. And some value is like 1 0 1 0 1, and here some value 102. So in this case, this is going to be 101, this is going to be 102, and this is going to be 1001, and this is going to be 1002, right? So here I can take two more records, right? Here also I can take two more records. So 103, 104, value 22, value 33, value 44, right? And here 101, 102 here. Now you can see this 101, this is one record. Okay, let me give this as 3 and 4. So this is the record 101, column ID, primary key, and this is the This is not the foreign key. This is column ID, primary key. This is the name column. Column ID1, and let me give this as column ID2. This column ID2, it is going to be the foreign key here. So here it is the foreign key, and here it is the foreign key. Right. So now you can see this record 101 can have multiple records in the table 2. Guys, so in table 1, we are having some column ID 1, which value is 1001. Is this value available multiple times in this column?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So this is the primary key, value is 101. So is this value available multiple times in this table?
Yes.
Yes.
That means now the two tables, right, table 1 and table 2, having many-to-many relationships. Right. But the thing is that you cannot implement the many-to-many relationship like this in SQL Server. Why I can't implement like this? The reason is, can I insert one record into this table? Is it possible to insert a record into this table or into this table the way we have implemented this? See, suppose first time you are coming, first time you are entering the data, then how you will specify this column value? Okay, you might be thinking that I will enter the table 2 data first, right? If you are entering the table 2 data, can you implement this table 2 data?
No.
No. That means what? It means you cannot implement the way I'm showing here. So in situations like this, a third table will come into the picture, and that third table will contain the primary key column values of both the tables. And in that way, it is going to maintain the many-to-many relationship, and that is what we are going to discuss, right? So again, we can, how it is going to create the third table, what is the structure of the third table, right? What are the primary, which are the primary key, which are the foreign key, that is what we are going to discuss. But before that, we just need to understand in two ways we can implement the many-to-many relationship. One is by following the convention, and second one is by following the Fluent API configuration, right? By to implement many-to-many relationship by following the default convention, it's very simple. It's very simple and it's very straightforward. So what you just need to do, you just need to include a collection navigation property at both ends. So what it means? It means whichever the entities you want, right? So whatever entity you want, both the entity should have the collection navigation property. Right? For example, the student class should have a collection navigation property of a course type, and the course class should also have a collection navigation property of student type to create many-to-many relationship between them without any configurations, right? Let us first understand this, right? So what I'm trying to do, I'm modifying the student entity, right? So very simple. So I'm having the student ID, first name, last name, and I'm having a collection application property, which is of type course. And this is the public constructor, and this constructor basically initializing these courses with some default, just initializing this property. And I'm not doing anything, right? Because initially I'm just initializing, I'm not storing anything. Later, once it is initialized, then you can store the values, right? And the second one is course entities. And in the course entity, let me create the course entity I have already created. Let me modify this. So this is also very straightforward. Here I'm having course ID, course name, and a collection property, which is pointing to the collection of students. So basically, again, this class having one constructor to initialize the student, and this student, and this student entity having one collection property. right? So the point that you need to remember, I want to implement many-to-many relationship between student and courses. That means one student can take multiple course and one course can be taken by multiple students. That means I want to implement many-to-many relationships. So what is the agenda in this case? In this case, one student can have multiple courses and one course, right? And here I want to implement one course can be taken by multiple students, right? So here you can see one course can be taken by multiple students. Why? Because we are having a collection property, right? And here you can see one student can be assigned or aligned with multiple courses. One student can register with multiple courses. So in this case, so there is a many-to-many relationship between the student and a courses. And without doing any kind of external configuration, Fluent API, data annotation, nothing, without doing anything, if we simply put the connection, collection, navigation property of one type in other type, then by default it is going to implement many-to-many relationships. So now you can see this student entity having one collection property which is of type course, and if you go to the course entity, it is also having one collection type of type collection property of type student. So with these changes, right, by default, it is going to create, right? It is going to create what it will create. It will create the it will implement the many-to-many relationship student, and the second one is course. So I have to use the courses, right? So these are the two things. Let me uncomment these things, right? So next we need to modify the main method, right? So we just need to modify the main method. And what I'm doing here, I'm creating a collection application. I'm creating collections, a list of courses. So I'm creating one course, two course, and using the add range method, I'm adding those courses to the database. So course added. Now this is student. So this is one student, first name Pranay, last name Raut, and his courses is these two, right? So you can see this first name last name is assigned with the courses. So currently the student Pranay Raut is assigned with two courses. One is C# and one is ASP.NET Core. And then I'm adding the student table, and then adding the data into the student entity and calling the set changes method, right? So let me delete these things. So in this case, once it generates the database, then I will tell you what exactly it is doing, right? So now go to the definition. So how many entities we have added? How many entities we have added into the context class? Two entities. One entity with the name students and another entity with the name courses. So in the database, it should create one table for students and another table for courses. But you will see some additional tables. So one table for courses, one table for students. But apart from these two tables, another table is there. And what is the name of that table? Student courses. So in the student table, you will see in the course table, you will see course ID and course name. So if you go to the course, so you will see course ID and course name. For reference property, they are not going to be created as columns, right? And for student, you will see there are also student ID, first name and last name. So for student entity, you will see student ID, first name and last name. Apart from these two, you will see another table. What is the table name? Student course. How many properties are there? Two properties, two columns. What are the student underscore student ID, course underscore course ID? And this property it is going to be a composite primary key, and it is also going to be a foreign key. Right now, if you open this data, then you will see the student ID 1, course ID 102. So this is a composite primary key, which is also the foreign key. Now, if you open the script, then you will see that it is creating a composite primary key, and both the key are also going to be foreign key, right? So this is the two columns, right? And this is my primary key. This primary key is created based on the student ID and course ID. Apart from that, they are also creating reference columns, and this reference is course this course ID, student course underscore course ID, is pointing to course table course ID, right? Course underscore course ID pointing to course table course ID, and this student underscore student ID column pointing student table student ID. That means it will create a composite primary key based on these two columns, as well as it will mark this column as the foreign key, and it will also mark this column as the foreign key. This is the third table which is created internally by Entity Framework to maintain the one-to-many relationships, right? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right? So this is the third table which is created by Entity Framework to maintain the one-to-many relationship between course and student. So whenever you enter course and student informations, right, automatically the data is going to enter into the course and students table automatically. Also, the data is going to inserted into the student courses table, right? So this is the default configurations, right? Now, what is our requirement? How we can implement these things using Fluent API. As we have already seen, the default entity framework convention create a joining table with the default naming convention for many-to-many relationships, right? So we need to use entity framework Fluent API if we want to customize the joining table name and the column names. So in this case, if you see what is the table name, student courses, right? Whatever the student whatever the entity is, so student plus course, then it is append es. And what is the table name? Entity framework will automatically create the joining table with the name of both entities and the suffix s. What are the entity name? Entity name is a course, right? Entity name is course, student course, then it will append s. So you will see the table name is student courses, right? And what is the default naming convention? Student underscore student ID, the column name course underscore course ID. So now what is our requirement? And our requirement is we do not want to go with the default naming convention, which is followed by entity framework for many-to-many relationships, right? Now what we need to do, we need to create, right, our own conventions, right? Right. So if you want to implement your own if you want to implement the student course table with your own convention, then what you need to do, you need to use the on model creating method, and you need to override the things, right? So first of all, you don't need to specify these things. So you can start with any. You can start with student, or you can also start with the courses, right? There is no issue, right? So I'm starting with the student, and this student having many relationship courses, and this course also having many relationship with students. So this will implement many-to-many relationship, and then I'm going to map. So if you remember the map method, and at that time I have told you, if we are having one entity and if you want to split that entity into multiple database table, then we need to use the map method, right? Similarly, the map method is also used for creating the mapping table, right? So mapping table means it is going to map these two tables data into a third table. So what is the map left key? Left key means what is the left table? Left table is student. What is the right table? Right table is courses, right? So it will create the student reference ID. So whatever the so in this case, what it will do, the primary key of student table will be created as student reference ID. The primary key of a course table will be created as a course reference ID. And then these two columns, right, will be created as student course table. So map left key, map right key. So left key in the sense, what is the left table? So left table is nothing but the first table which you specify in the entity. What is the right table? Then the second, what you specify, courses, right? And then you just created the two table, you just created. So left key, you just map the left key with the left key in the sense what? The student table primary key column with this student reference ID. So you just map the course table primary key column with the course reference ID column. And once you have these two columns, you do not want to prefer the default naming conventions. So you want to create a student course info, student course information, right? You want to create the table name as student course informations. So whatever the table name you want, you need to specify to this two table method. With this above changes in place, if you run the application, then what will happen? So now it is not going to create the student course table. So it is going to create the student course information table. And in this student course information table, you will not find this default naming, right? Student underscore student ID or course underscore course ID. Rather, you will see student reference ID and course reference ID. The student reference ID will refer to the student table primary key column, and this course reference ID column will refer to the course table primary key column, right? So let me delete this one and run the code once more, right? Database deleted, yes. Now run the application. You do not need to do any kind of changes in the main method, just run the application. Once you run the application, then you will see that it is working as expected as the default convention what we see in the previous example, except now the table, the database, what it is going to created, it is going to created with the, it is not generated yet, so it is going to generate. Okay, so the database is generated. We do not need to check the student and courses table because the structure is going to be same. We just need to check this one. What is the name of the table now? Student course information. Why? Because in the Fluent API we have provided the name like this. And if you expand these things, then you will see that the reference student reference ID and the course reference ID. So previously, whatever the name, it is replaced with this name. Now, if you expand, then you will get the data as expected. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So this is how you need to implement one-to-one, many-to-many, and one-to-many relationship using the default conventions as well as using the Fluent API configurations. That's it for today. In tomorrow we are going to discuss if you are having one existing database, then we work with the Entity Framework Code First approach? If yes, then how? That is what we are going to discuss tomorrow. Any question from anyone related to today's session?
No.
Thank you, guys. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.